Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of CEO and Market Expert Interviews. I'm your host, Lucian. Some of you know me as Triangle Investor from X. Today, we have a very special guest in my show, and that is Will Shackel. Will is a 17-year-old founder of Nuclear for Australia, the largest Australian grassroots movement for nuclear energy in the nation's history, with over 25,000 supporters. He will tell us more about himself and his work, but let's welcome him first. Will, welcome to my show. It is great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Will. Will, you are pretty known in Australia and in other parts of the world too, but I would like to ask you nevertheless to share us your story. How and when did you become interested in nuclear energy, and tell us more about Nuclear for Australia?
So I guess it's a bit of an unusual story because obviously nuclear power is banned in Australia, and we're not really taught about what nuclear is in Australia besides, maybe the scare stories of Chernobyl or something like that. So it's a bit unusual for, I guess, a young person in Australia to care so deeply about nuclear power. But basically, like most young people, I was concerned about climate change. I was doing some school assignments, and over the course of those school assignments, I came across the idea of nuclear power. I looked into how it was being used around the world. And then I think it was probably 2 years ago when I realized it was banned in Australia. And that just shocked me that we wouldn't be considering this clean energy option, which is literally being used in 32 countries around the world at the moment. And to think that a nation as advanced and as proud as Australia just would ban it like that, would prohibit it, would rule it out, just simply shocked me. So after then, I basically started reaching out to experts. I probably was harassing them, if anything, by just spamming connect on LinkedIn and starting to have conversations with them, learning about all sides of the nuclear power debate and trying to understand it myself and doing more research. It was then where, as most young people do who care about different causes, I set up an Instagram page. I started sharing content, just making it up on Canva. And then over time that grew and grew. I was able to get more support. I provided testimony to a Senate committee in our capital of Canberra, where I was basically advocating for the ban on nuclear power to be lifted to our Australian senators. And then after that moment, it started getting quite a bit of media attention. So I had the opportunity to debate our energy and climate minister on a national TV show. And then most recently, I was able to attend COP28, where there's a lot of, it was a really eye-opening experience for me, and was able to make a lot of progress in the Australian debate, in particular, when I had the opportunity to talk to the French President Emmanuel Macron, where he, in that moment, speaking to me, called on Australia to lift the ban on nuclear power, which I think it's been over 5 months now. It still has not been adequately responded to, which I think shocks me. So that's probably a story of how it's gone, specifically in terms of Nuclear for Australia and what that is. Nuclear for Australia, like you described it at the start, is an organisation which is basically been made to advance the cause of nuclear science in Australia. So we don't just cover nuclear power. It's also, recognising and celebrating the fact that Australia has a world-leading nuclear science capability, which, to be honest, most Australians don't realise. Yeah. Most Australians don't realise we've got a research reactor 30 kilometres from the Sydney CBD. Most Australians don't know that we've got the most uranium in the world. Yeah. And it's all of these simple facts that people need to understand so we can help destigmatize the word nuclear. So what we're doing is obviously, I advocate a lot through my work around nuclear science and in particular nuclear power and for the ban to be lifted. But we specifically at the moment running a campaign on lifting the ban on nuclear power, and we've been quite successful in doing that, to the point where our petition to lift the ban on nuclear power now has over 25,000 signatures, and we're running a digital campaign over many platforms to help share with the facts with as many people in Australia as possible. So I hope that's a good enough summary of
Great
what I'm up.
summary, really great summary, and very impressive for a 17-year-old man. Will, what is the rationale for the government to keep nuclear ban going forward? Tell me more, please. Educate
I
our
wish I could.
audience.
I wish I could. I do not understand it at all. And I have to say most Australians don't understand it. When you look at the polling done in Australia, a majority of Australians just simply go, this does not stack up. Why on earth would we be banning one of the cleanest and most reliable technologies that exists around the world, which has been statistically proven to be one of the safest technologies around the world? Now, if you ask our government why nuclear power is banned, they can no longer, cite their safety concerns or waste concerns, because in Australia, our government is committed to spending over 300 billion Australian dollars on floating nuclear reactors in the form of the AUKUS agreement, which was an agreement for nuclear power submarines between Australia, the US, and UK. So not only are we getting nuclear submarines, but we're also going to have to manage the waste from that. So if they started criticizing, and raising doubts about the safety and the waste, then they're putting that defense project in jeopardy. And I think it also it would seriously undermine Australia's current nuclear capacity in the form of the Lucas Heights reactor. If they were also to, stir a bit of doubt about safety and waste. So the only justification they've got left for keeping the ban, and I've asked them, is that one, nuclear costs too much, and two, that nuclear would take too long to build. And that just boggles my mind. I've used this example before, but if we were going around banning things just because they're too expensive, no one would be able to buy a Gucci handbag in Australia. And certainly no one would be able to purchase electric cars. It's that ridiculous. You wouldn't be able to, purchase solar panels back in the day. If we're going to ban technologies just because they apparently cost too much and they take too long to build, then you're not going to get any technological advancement. And I think that's so concerning for our country that we've put ourselves in that position. And the simple fact is that even though the government is claiming that it takes too long to build, it's too expensive, they cannot have any evidence of that and how nuclear would actually work and stack up in the Australian environment unless they lift the ban. Because why on earth would a nuclear vendor, present their business plans to a government which has shut the door on them without even giving them the look in?
Yeah.
It just simply astounds me. I'm of the belief that it's untenable. I do not see a future in Australia where nuclear would continue to stay banned. I think that there is growing momentum. I think Australians are waking up to the fact that this is ridiculous. We're the only member of the G20 with a ban on nuclear power. And I think with all of the support we're receiving, with the public support, and just those simple facts, that the ban will be lifted. And I think that will be a very, very important moment for this country.
Yeah, that was actually my next question. How is the nation's sentiment for nuclear power at the moment? Is this a generation thing where young people are pro-nuclear and the older population is still conservative, with conservative views?
I think it's quite complicated. I would split it up into a few different groups. I think, first of all, in terms of age. So in terms of young people, I think the thing with young people in Australia, they haven't been exposed to, like young people my age.
Yeah.
They're not Simpsons viewers. They haven't been exposed to the fear created by events like Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, etc. They haven't lived through that. And because of that, they're basically on a blank slate. They're willing to consider nuclear power. They are, however, and this is reflected in polls, less supportive than other generations in Australia to nuclear power. And I think the reason why that is because there has been, first of all, I think there is a lack of understanding that Australia's 100% renewables energy pathway is realistic. I think that a lot of young people it has never been challenged to them that renewables alone could power Australia. And I think there is not enough education about how energy grids work and the complexities that are posed. I think like any young person would love to believe that a 100% renewables energy pathway will work. I would love to believe that. But as I've gone talking to experts and looked around the world, it's very clear that other countries are looking to nuclear and wanting to use it in their mix because we can't just rely on renewables. So I think that's the thing with young people. There's a openness to it, but there's also they don't really know why it's needed. So they're not going to be vocal yet. The second group I would say is like my parents' generation. Now, this is the group that is proving to be the most difficult in Australia because they were growing up in the midst of the Cold War. Where, my mum will, mention to me that she was worried that a nuclear weapon would be dropped in Australia. And there's this weird conflation with nuclear weapons with nuclear power in Australia, which I think needs to be addressed. But in addition, they were living through the events of Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, and the facts haven't really reached them. And this is particularly true of women of that age in Australia. There is a concern at the back of their heads, that what would happen to my children or whatever in the case that a 1 in a million chance of something going wrong did go wrong. So that's the concern with them. The important thing though with that age group is that this is a really important age group because they're currently struggling with the cost of living crisis in Australia with power bills going up. And once they realize that, it's not just a coincidence that the current energy transition could be contributing to that, I actually think they're much more likely to support nuclear. And the third age group is, the third group I'll talk about is the older Australians. It's surprising. The older generation are most supportive of nuclear power in Australia, which would shock you. But it's because there's a minority who obviously completely just ruled nuclear out. They're the old style environmentalists who are just like, oh, Fukushima, nuclear waste, can't have it. There's then the broader group, they tend to be more conservative and therefore they tend to be opposed to renewables. And they then equate that to support for nuclear power. And for a lot of them, I think they've taken the time to realize that nuclear power is a good solution for Australia and they've changed their minds. So it's I hope that that was a very long explanation, but that's sort of a summary of how I see the situation playing out in Australia. But broadly, I'd emphasize that there is community support for nuclear. There's more support for building nuclear power plants in Australia than there is for not. And in terms of the ban specifically, more than a majority of Australians support the ban being lifted. That's just the evidence everywhere suggests that.
Yeah,
agreed. The last thing I would say is that when the ban on nuclear power was introduced, it was never taken to the people. There was not an election where people were voting for the bans on nuclear power to be introduced. So the fact that there is such strong community support, I think suggests that the current ban staying in place is just simply undemocratic. And it goes against the will of the people, that politicians made a decision, in the late 1990s without consulting people at the dead of night in the Australian Parliament, which has set our country back so far, yet a majority of Australians actually oppose that decision. I think that is quite a shocking thing as well.
Okay, Will, how is the pro-nuclear opposition about the nuclear future? Have you talked with Peter Dutton, maybe? Any support there?
So obviously the coalition government is currently looking at a nuclear power policy. I've never met the opposition leader. I met Ted O'Brien at Q&A, which was the live TV show I was on, and that was the first time I ever met him. And that was also when I met, he's the Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy in Australia. I also then had I actually think before I met him, I met Chris Bowen, our actual Minister for Energy and Climate Change. I wrote to our Prime Minister in May last year for a meeting. I've requested that. I've spoken to my local MP, which is the only meeting with any politician I've had. And I raised my my support for nuclear power with him. But I've certainly reached out and I've certainly made an appeal. But I think what's more important is that these politicians don't listen to me, because at the end of the day, I'm a 17-year-old. And whilst I might now have a sort of good command over this topic because I've deeply invested a lot of time in it, I talked to lots of experts and have now visited nuclear power plant through Baraka. I think the most important thing for these politicians is actually to start, picking up the phone to all of the nuclear experts in Australia who have been demanding to have their voices heard. And it's not just people involved in Australia's current nuclear science capability. These are people who have worked overseas developing other countries' nuclear power capacities, yet can't do their same work in Australia. I'm talking, about people like Helen Cook, who is probably the most respected nuclear lawyer in the world from Australia, helps other countries establish their nuclear power capabilities, yet she currently doesn't have any work from it in her home country. And I think that is devastating. I think there is a serious need for our leaders in Australia to open the door to these experts who have been saying for a long time that they need to consider nuclear power.
Sorry. Yeah, agreed. Will, what are your thoughts on this election being won or lost on energy policy? Do you see Australia ending up like Germany with the current government gets back in?
I would hope not. I simply don't know what will happen, and no one knows what will happen because the current 100% renewables pathway is simply unproven.
Yeah.
And that really does concern me. If it leads to increasing energy insecurity, a lack of economic competitiveness for Australia and high power bills, as frankly they're seeing in Germany, I think that's really bleak. What I would say is, from my point of view, the next election result obviously is important, because say if the coalition would get in, then they would theoretically lift the ban. But that doesn't mean much if our government, the Labor Party, the second largest party, the other party in Australia, doesn't support nuclear power. I do not see how a nuclear power reactor could possibly be built in Australia without bipartisan support.
Yeah.
And that's where my focus is. Nuclear for Australia is a non-partisan movement for nuclear power. And I've been very upfront and very clear about that from the start of what I'm doing. I'm not a member of any political party. I've never intended to be, nor of any members of our governance. We are genuinely just passionate about nuclear power, and for my sake, selfishly, because I think we need it to be able to guarantee a good future for myself and for my peers.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. My focus is on getting the Labor government to support nuclear power in Australia, because I think we need that. Whilst it would be, possibly the ban would be lifted, it'd be pretty pointless if, say, that party got voted out in the next election and then we're back to square one. So that's where my priority is. And I think that's really important. And we should be able to replicate the situation in, the US and UK where there is bipartisanship on nuclear. There's no reason why it shouldn't be bipartisan in Australia. And I think that at the end of the day, when you see all that's happening in nuclear these days, all the countries, just frankly committed to tripling nuclear power across the world, it would be politically very unstrategic for the Labor Party to continue their opposition to nuclear power, because they'd be out of step with their colleagues from around the world in their movement.
Will, what energy mix would you suggest Australia should have? Something like France. France has nuclear like 65% plus solar, wind, and hydro, or that is not realistic in, of course, in the short term, not even in the mid term. Or you would suggest something more like Sweden model or some other countries. What's your take?
I think the first thing to preface everything that I say is, once again, I'm 17.
Yeah.
I'm not pretending that I understand the complexities of the Australian grid. And I don't think I do need to know that to understand why nuclear power would be a beneficial solution. So I think from my point of view, I think that there definitely needs to be, we definitely need renewables. Australia has a fantastic advantage in renewables, the same way we have a fantastic advantage with nuclear power, frankly. And we need to play on both of those strengths in Australia. We've got a fantastic distributed solar PV network. If I was to walk around in my street, most of the houses would have solar panels on their roof, and that's something that other countries simply don't have. And that's a huge benefit for Australia. So I think we definitely need to keep on investing in renewables, but at the same time, there is definitely a role for nuclear. If it's not having a commanding position in our energy grid, I think, and we are already seeing this, there are Australian mining companies who are in talks with Westinghouse for their Vinci reactor, even though it's banned.
Yeah.
So there is, even if it would be because of, the domestic grid or whatever, I think there's always a role for nuclear in Australia, whether it is for those industries, whether it's for data centers, whether it's for people who, want to live remote off the grid. And that shouldn't concern anyone if they want to be able to do that. But I think the most important thing right now is that, first of all, the ban is lifted. And if we want to have serious discussions about the role of nuclear power in our grid, then the ban, must be lifted, and there must be resources in terms to investigate that, because currently it's just impossible to investigate that in Australia. And because it is banned, and it always keeps on coming back to the ban on nuclear power, because that's been designed to set back nuclear. Because it is banned, when our government organizations in Australia say that nuclear is not needed, the thing is, they just can't justify dedicating resources to properly investigating it under this current environment, and that needs to change. And then at that point, we can have those discussions about what a grid with the option for nuclear would actually look like as compared to our current proposal.
Yeah. Well, final question. You already emphasized that Australia has the most uranium in the world, but uranium mining is still banned in some Australian states as well. Do you see any progress in that field in lifting those bans?
Well, I'm in Queensland at the moment, and I'm very unhappy because uranium mining is banned in Queensland, and it's banned in most states and territories, like you said, across Australia. Unfortunately, the opposition party here in my state also opposes nuclear power, but I'm hoping that they lift the ban on uranium mining here. What I would say that's really, really important, and this comes back to my concern about climate change, is obviously it's one conversation to suggest that Australia should have nuclear power plants here. And I think it's a conversation we need to have, and I think it's really important. But I think the real impact Australia could have is at which point we unlock our uranium reserves, the largest in the world. My understanding, we've got 33% of the uranium reserves in the world. We unlock that and we start enriching it so we can ship it across the world to help other countries decarbonize with clean nuclear power. If we care about climate change, if our politicians actually cared, that's what they would be doing. That would be one of the biggest differences, I think, in that we could possibly make. At the end of the day, other countries also have critical minerals. There are going to be massive environmental complaints when people realize that this critical mineral boom in Australia is also going to see massive amounts of mining. And you compare it to uranium, where obviously it's a limited amount of actual raw materials extracted. I actually think it's a much easier proposition for people, and I think it's a much bigger impact we could have on the world. So in addition to nuclear power, I'm very, very passionate about that. And that is something that we will be campaigning for as part of Nuclear for Australia. And that's something that also the chair of Nuclear for Australia, Adi Paterson, cares deeply about.
Will, I wish you luck with your activities going forward. That was Will Shackel. Thank you very much for this interview. It was a great chat as I expected. And like I said, good luck.
Thank you so much.